Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 13 of Truth is Justice. Confirmation bias. Now, it's an interesting term and one that is commonly used to explain why people on either side of a debate, and the discussion of this case is no exception, how they may not see things from a particular perspective. It's used by some to defend a position. For example, you don't want to see the evidence of the intruder because you've already made up your mind on the case. In reality, it's a catch-all response to factual evidence. When you're unable to dispute the evidence presented to you or the explanation provided to you, you simply accuse the opposing side of confirmation bias and then walk away feeling that the debate has been won. I thought it'd be good to talk briefly about confirmation bias, so what it is and how it can be problematic to assume that people who do not agree with a particular line of thinking fall into this category. A confirmation bias can be best summed up by saying that it involves the process of favouring information that confirms your existing beliefs, and that can manifest in a few different ways. It can involve the researching of material to support your beliefs, and in that instance, only conducting research into the areas that support your argument, regardless of whether they are valid or not. And it can involve the interpretation of material in a way that supports your beliefs, and at the same time rejecting other interpretations that are perhaps in conflict with your beliefs. And it can also manifest by recalling from memory those examples and that evidence and that data which supports your beliefs. Once again, rejecting memories of examples, evidence and data which are in conflict with your beliefs. We can see examples of confirmation bias in different everyday ways. Say you have your mind set on buying a new fully electric car. You look for articles on electric car manufacturers and reviews of their cars and the benefits of an electric car over a hybrid or a fuel-based engine. And depending on how committed you are to buying an electric car, you might find yourself adding more weight to articles that are positive with respect to electric cars than they are negative. It can also be less obvious than that. So say you've moved homes and you need to find a dentist. What might you search for online? You might search for maybe dentists in your new town. And in the search results, there might be a website listing out bad dentists in your new town. And would you click on that? Probably not. Would you click on the link for best family dentists in your town, if that's what you needed, a family dentist? Probably. Would you read all of the bad dentist links to cross-reference them to the good ones? No, probably not. And that is confirmation bias. You're looking for confirmation of your bias, confirmation of your beliefs. And is that a bad thing? No, not necessarily. It's simply adaptation, and in many ways it can make us very efficient in decisions. In the electric car example, imagine if your car search began at the very basic level of transport, the need to get from A to B. Why do you even need a car over a bicycle? Why could you not just take public transport? Or why would you just not walk? Even if you painstakingly progress to a logical decision that you need a car, the decisions then branch out into so many different directions. So many different directions that you'd be undoubtedly overwhelmed by all the choices. So car make and model, whether to purchase, lease or rent, whether it's a new or a used car. So you deliberately and consciously and subconsciously narrow that search based on what you know to be certain factors, elements that you have been able to make a decision on. Now, whilst these examples may seem somewhat unrelated to the process of analysing a crime scene, bear with me. I'll join the dots. Now remember my hammer example in last week's episode. Well, imagine that court case playing out if someone was charged with the murder of the individual and DNA and fingerprints had been found on the glove and the hammer beside where they were murdered. Assume that the DNA and fingerprints hadn't been matched to anyone. Now imagine that the evidence pointing to the person charged with the murder is all circumstantial, but somewhat compelling. And the defendant at trial had a relationship with the man who was murdered, and whilst motive wasn't necessarily clear, they had no alibi and a reason to be at the house that evening when the man was murdered. If you believe the defendant is guilty, you might dismiss the unknown DNA and fingerprints on the glove and hammer as being irrelevant. You might say that there is no evidence that they were even used in the crime, and no evidence that the unknown DNA and fingerprints is related to the murderer in any way. However, people who believe in the innocence of the defendant will scream confirmation bias and will argue that the unknown DNA and fingerprints means that there is no way a jury could possibly find the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And what's the answer? How do we reach that end decision rather than, like the car example, potentially going through every single possibility until the conclusion of each is reached, many with no definitive outcome? The answer is the criminal justice system, and every single element operating within it. As we spoke about last week, the people tasked with the incredibly difficult job of investigating homicide cases are not armchair analysts. They are highly experienced, trained, experts in their fields, and they know what to look for. Because, and presumably, Mr Carpenter didn't physically get up on the roof of the Melgar's home and take photos of every single roof tile to assess whether the claimed intruder entered through the roof. It doesn't mean that we see confirmation bias explainable by Mr Carpenter turning the other way with respect to how an intruder may have gained entry. It means that Mr Carpenter saw things in the crime scene that stood out to him, based on his experience and based on all of his training. He was applying all of his knowledge to what was in front of him and the analysis that he was conducting as he progressed around the crime scene. Now, people have claimed that we here at Truth is Justice are guilty of confirmation bias. And that's a curious accusation, because almost exclusively we have been correcting misleading statements. I do, on occasion, offer my personal opinion on different aspects, and usually when I do so in a way to balance an argument that I think is fraught with difficulties. It's my attempt to balance the ledger, to give a different perspective on an element of the case. What we do is not an example of confirmation bias, it's fact-checking. That is our motivation, as we have so often explained. Now, let's look at some of the points that we've raised in this context. So could the poster have been torn off the wall by an intruder? Sure, if you want to believe that and come up with a scenario where that happened, I'm sure one is potentially possible. Importantly though, is it even remotely likely? No, of course not. Not at all, and we demonstrated to you the reasons why. Did panicked and rushed intruders leave through the garage carrying large and very heavy items, supposedly along with at least one other knife, manoeuvring through a cluttered garage without causing any visual disturbance, significant or otherwise, and stepping over bags of stacked leaves without so much as nudging them? And once again, if you want to come up with a scenario where that is possible, then I'm absolutely sure you could. But is it at all likely under those circumstances? Again, no, it's not even remotely plausible. And this is what we see with so many different elements of this case. We see scenarios created that, whilst physically possible, are highly unlikely. And as soon as you add those two items together, the probability of them happening becomes even less likely. So add 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 more elements, and the probability then becomes so slim that the alternative is considerably beyond reasonable doubt. And that is not the application of confirmation bias resulting in the conviction of a murderer. It is the reality of the facts, combined with the tens of thousands of hours that have gone into investigating and prosecuting the case. For those convinced of and those profiting from a position based on Sandra's innocence, the beauty of the case is there are very, very few, arguably zero, circumstances where they could be proven wrong in their position, the position that Sandra is innocent. So from an eyewitness coming forward pointing the finger at Sandra, that would simply be explained away as why didn't they come forward earlier, to DNA evidence confirming that Sandra is the murderer, and that'd be explained as being planted or misinterpreted or contaminated in some way. Now, neither of those elements likely exist, I'm just making a point. But in reality, even an actual admission of guilt by Sandra would be easily and readily dismissed by some as Sandra simply wanting to put the matter behind her, along with, I'm sure, there'd be some details contained within a confession that had potential inaccuracies and was therefore determined by her supporters to somehow not be truthful. And the point being, it's a wonderful position to argue from when the reality is your position can be overwhelmingly argued against factually, but you can simply change your argument an infinite number of times, or simply ignore the overwhelming factual arguments against your narrative. And by way of an example, and it's a slightly silly example, but it's an example nonetheless, it can never be proven to everyone that the Loch Ness Monster does not exist. In fact, even when the most famous photograph, the so-called surgeon's photo of 1934, was confirmed as an elaborate hoax, many people still firmly believe that the monster exists, and many based on that photo. Now, even if the massive loch was drained, it could be argued that the monster moved to another area upon the disturbance. So, to those convinced that the monster exists, there's actually no method that could be used to convince them otherwise. And that is where the justice system and the legal processes entrenched within it are so crucially important. The system allows the consideration of a matter from a point where it's virtually impossible to determine someone's guilt when you have endless possibilities in front of you, like with the car decision, and then takes it through centuries of development to a point where only the most relevant elements are considered and presented. Every aspect of it, from the importance of the role of respective legal counsels during trial to the relevance of sometimes difficult to understand rules of evidence to the role of the jury. So whilst at Truth is Justice we concentrate on correcting the misleading statements, if you're interested in hearing about the importance of the trial and to hear about this case specifically from a trial perspective, I highly recommend tuning into the Getting Off podcast with Jessa and Nick. It makes for very interesting listening and provides you with another angle through which to consider this case. So to sum up, by going back to the original topic of confirmation bias, is it a bad thing? Well, not necessarily. The answer depends on how it is managed and how aware we are of the process. The one thing that it always does is it provides those people on one side of an argument with the ability to explain why points that they believe are so important are not more widely accepted. Think about it. Without confirmation bias, conspiracy theories would simply disappear. At the end of last week's episode, we highlighted how Bob had suggested that his work over the first several weeks of this case had brought to light several areas of the crime scene that, in Bob's view, are clear indicators of a burglary. Now let's take a closer look at that claim, because I completely disagree that we have indicators of a burglary. So, progressing through the house and starting with the front door. As you know, the front door shows no signs of forced entry, and based on Herman's account, we can assume it was locked when Herman, Maria and their family arrived. So what's relevant about the front door is its position with respect to the house and the visibility of other homes. It's set back from the garage and from the southeast corner bedroom, so it's private and somewhat protected compared to the rest of the front of the house. And that's relevant, we'll talk about that in a little while. And then moving on to the southeast corner bedroom. And we have some drawers opened, we have an open jewellery box, and we have two items on the ground beside the jewellery box. We have a heavy poster that's fallen away from the wall, and we have a claimed stolen Xbox. Now, the contents of the drawers are entirely undisturbed. The jewellery box appears to have been kept that way, evidenced by the items draped over one of the open doors. The items on the ground may be able to be considered out of place if they weren't directly beneath the jewellery box, and if there weren't loose items on the top of the dresser, and if the room and the house generally was perfectly kept, but as is evidenced by all the photos, that isn't. Now, the claimed stolen Xbox was supposedly located in that back rear corner under the bed. Intruders would have needed to get down on the floor to even see it. So aside from the open drawers, the contents of the room, including the closet, appear completely undisturbed. There's a laptop on clear display on the daybed beside the window, something any intruders would have had to pass before getting down on the floor to find the Xbox. Next up is the guest bedroom, and the supposed evidence of an intruder there, well, we have the open doors of the armoire. Nothing's disturbed inside the armoire. In fact, nothing at all appears disturbed inside the room or the closet. And what appears to be a tabletop is leaning against the legs of an ironing board, with the suggestion that it was likely leaning against the armoire at some point and the intruders moved it to gain access. And whilst that's something that of course can't be disproven, it appears highly unlikely because the iron and the spray bottle are standing upright on the ironing board, apparently undisturbed by a heavy tabletop being pushed aside and landing on the ironing board's legs. Now, of note here is a suggestion that the armoire was likely targeted because it appeared to be something that contained, as Bob describes, all sorts of treasures, as a result of its timber design. And again, that's relevant, we'll talk about it in a minute. And next is the study. Now, it's not suggested that the intruders entered into this room. There's various narratives about them having been disturbed. Now, whilst there may not be any evidence of an intruder, we have some interesting items in the study, as a lot of you know. This is where we have the 32-inch TV DVD player, and it's also where it is understood that the laptops and the desktop computer were collected from for the purposes of the investigation. Now, if you get a chance to have a look at the photos of the desk in the study. Actually, I'll put the photos up on the page on our website associated with this episode for you to look at. And notice the empty space in front of the monitor. There's been a lot of talk about the empty space on the cabinet in the master bedroom, but very little talk. In fact, I can't recall it ever being mentioned about this empty space on the desk. And whilst the keyboard is not visible, it may be that it's on a slide-out tray under the desk. And my thoughts on that space? It's that was usually reserved for a laptop. And next up is the living room. The evidence offered up for intruders in this room, the protruding cable from the device cabinet and the presence of the large flat-screen TV. Nothing else appears disturbed in this room. The stacked devices, including a DVD player and speakers, do not appear touched. A stack of DVD cases with loose CDs or DVDs on top doesn't appear disturbed. A space in the device cabinet claimed to be where the Xbox was sitting doesn't even appear to fit the Xbox without rearranging things, something I highly doubt an intruder would have any interest in doing. As for the TV still being there, I'm not quite sure how the presence of the TV can be used by someone to argue intruders, but it does show you that you can use anything really to tell a story, if you sell it well enough. And next is the kitchen. The evidence of intruders, the two open cabinet doors, one containing Tupperware and the other containing alcohol. Neither Tupperware or alcohol appears to be stolen, and both the Tupperware and the alcohol are relevant when we move into the master bathroom. And then we move on to the back door. And the claims have changed at different times, from the doggy door being a method of potential entry through the use of a long stick or pole to manipulate the deadbolt, to a crowbar or screwdriver being used to force the door, to a lock picker being able to manipulate the lock from the outside. And what do we actually see? We see a door that has clearly had a doorknob removed and either replaced or repositioned at some point. Note here that Jim was somewhat of a handyman and liked to undertake repairs to both his house and the rental properties himself. The door itself and the door hardware also appears to be quite well used and not recently painted or cleaned. The outside of the door is different though. It's in good condition with very few marks and no signs of forced entry. It's also clear from the outside of the door that the doorknob has been removed and either replaced or repositioned at some point. Now, as for marks from screwdrivers or crowbars on the outside of the door, like we've told you before, there simply aren't any. There's nothing. The doggy door claims, well, even if you were patient and calm enough to manoeuvre a long stick or pole through the doggy door to manipulate the deadbolt whilst 4 barking dogs were alerting your presence to not only the occupants of the home but to nearby neighbours, you'd still have to deal with the lock on the actual doorknob. And that is where the lock-picking explanation presented itself. The claimed evidence of the lock-picking, that the keyhole on the outside of the door is horizontal rather than vertical. Now, whilst I have some interest in the art of lock-picking, I'm definitely not an expert and I defer to those highly skilled in that area, but a more straightforward explanation for me than a keyhole jamming in the horizontal position after a supposed lockpicking attempt is that Jim reinstalled the round doorknob at a 90-degree angle. So perhaps the screw holes were worn and would no longer hold the doorknob securely, so Jim simply turned the knob 90 degrees to the left. Evidence of that? Well, the screw visible on the internal doorknob being at the top of the knob. Now, in my experience, and of course there'll be plenty of examples where this isn't the case, but in my experience, and I've replaced my share of doorknobs, normally the screws have been at the side of the doorknob. And why is it that way? Well, perhaps it's because that's more visually appealing that way, especially if there isn't a cover plate to cover the screws, which is the case in this instance. Now, is that 100% the definite explanation? No, of course not. But does it fit with all of the evidence in a reasonable, practical, and mostly simple way, and avoid needing wild, extravagant stories of sticks, poles, lockpickers amongst 4 barking dogs? Yes, completely. And then we move to the dining room. Now, there's no evidence of an intruder here either, but we do have a glassware cabinet that is closed and appears completely undisturbed. And then we move on to the laundry. And there's no evidence of intruders there, and so we move on to the garage. Now, what's the claimed evidence of intruders being in the garage? Well, we have a backpack containing the Xbox and a game and some jewelry. And we also have the open garage door. The backpack is interesting. So for those suggesting it is an intruder, think briefly about the process. It's suggested that the intruders systematically searched through the home, beginning with the southeast corner bedroom, yet they've begun searching for valuables without having anything to actually collect the valuables in. And how do we know that? Well, the backpack found with the Xbox is Liz's old school backpack, so it was in the home. Now, where in the home? Well, of course we don't know for sure, but it may have been in Liz's bedroom or in her closet, which is the southeast corner bedroom. Now, it strikes me as unusual that a backpack taken from one room would remain empty until making it to the living room where the Xbox was supposedly stolen from. Yet, it contained a game, Gears of War, that Liz last claimed was played in her bedroom. So the order is confusing again. The backpack is taken, perhaps from Liz's bedroom, the game is taken from there, and so is the claimed stolen white Xbox. But the game itself isn't placed with the claimed stolen Xbox. It's placed in the empty backpack, whilst the Xbox is placed in some other bag. And sure, you can make it all work if you apply enough lateral thinking, but like with so many aspects of this case, for it to fit, it requires some very unusual events to have taken place. Now, the open garage door, well, for me that would be a highly unusual choice for panicked intruders to exit from. Not only is there no clear path to outside, you also have to manoeuvre around a very busy garage complete with blocked exit. As I've said previously, even if the other door was opened, it isn't a clear exit. There's very little space around the car, especially if you're carrying the heavy power tools. Notably, they're from the side of the garage where the open door is. You're also carrying a TV, a DVD player, a guitar, at least one knife. It's just incredibly unusual, especially given the visibility of the garage door to the neighbours. The garage extends well beyond the front of the house, and it's in clear view of the neighbours' side windows. Now, evidence of intruders? No, I think it's evidence of a garage door opened to manipulate Sandra's discovery. And then the master bathroom. And the evidence of an intruder there, well, we have the open jewellery box with empty compartments, and of course we have the items in the jacuzzi, the knife, the blouse and the towels. Now, the state of the jewellery box may be relevant, again, if the general state of the house was different. But it also doesn't represent a difficult thing to stage if necessary. If small items of jewellery could easily be spread across the pockets of different clothes or sections of bags and other bags spread throughout the house. Now, if you were conscious of them being discovered, they could easily just be flushed down the toilet or pushed down the drain. And the items in the jacuzzi, well, that'll be a subject of greater discussion in a coming episode, but to on the one hand argue that multiple knives were used, yet only one was thrown in the jacuzzi, seems like a strange argument. To suggest that the female intruder wore a burgundy sweater yet took off a white blouse also seems strange. And to suggest that the murder triggered panic amongst the intruders, yet the knife was left out of the jacuzzi for long enough to allow some drying of the blood, seems strange. I don't think we see evidence of intruders. I actually think this is the first room in the house where we see signs of the crime scene potentially being staged. The master bathroom closet is next, and what evidence do we see there? Well, we see a section of shelving that is empty with a bag on the floor and a box on the dresser. We don't see a search-through closet. In fact, what we do see is a small ornate timber box sitting on top of the dresser, directly below the space on the shelves, which has not been disturbed at all. So on the one hand, an armoire is described as being attractive to the intruders as potentially containing all sorts of treasures, yet an obvious ornate box on top of a dresser is just completely disregarded. And that leaves us with the master bedroom that we covered last week, so I won't go over that much again, other than to say, in my view, it has further signs of a staged crime scene. So to return to the first point, which was Bob's claim of finding clear indicators of a burglary, I think the evidence just simply doesn't support that. It doesn't support a burglary at all. But what we have found is that through false claims, misleading statements, baseless attacks on the crime scene investigator Mr Carpenter, and in some instances some quite extraordinary leaps with respect to the evidence, the scene has been somewhat set up by Bob to suggest to his audience clear evidence of a burglary. So hopefully what we've been able to do here is to add some fact to the fiction around that description. To continue now with the master bedroom closet and the area immediately outside it. The first items described are the dining chair with a blue striped blanket noted as lying across the seat of the chair, and a stool. The position of these is noted as being in the master bedroom at the entrance to the master bedroom closet. Bob begins with the dining chair, and specifically with the blood drops. And this is where we see quite an extraordinary layperson insight suggested by Bob with respect to the blood pattern, and it continues for many weeks. In fact, the discussion with respect to blood drops is still continuing. So Bob analyses the blood drops, and he does it in quite a significant way, with significant detail, with a focus on specific areas of the drops and what the nature of those drops means. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, except this is where experience becomes highly important, and why experts are so crucial when it comes to the accurate analysis of information. And it's also where we begin to see the creation of another villain in this case, Ms. Rossi. Some of you may be familiar with the name Ms. Rossi. Ms. Rossi is the bloodstain pattern analysis analyst who provided expert testimony at Sandra's trial. Now we'll talk further about Ms. Rossi's qualifications and experience next week, and those qualifications and Ms. Rossi's scientific experience and reputation in the field is substantial, not just in Texas or in the United States, but on the world stage. For now, remember what we spoke about last week with respect to the importance of experience. Now, coupled with world-leading qualifications and a reputation for excellence, the findings of Ms. Rossi cannot be disputed lightly. And Bob then moves on to the internal closet. And what we learn from that part of the report is the size of the closet. It was very small, with interior dimensions of 8 feet or 2.4 metres east to west by 4 feet or 1.2 metres north to south. So to put this in context, Jim was found in a slumped position against the back wall of the closet, and his feet were protruding from the closet door. There's very little space in there. So why is the size of the closet relevant, and why is it something that you actually hear very little about? Because as we discuss in the coming weeks, the suggestion is that at least 2 people were in that closet with Jim, fighting him with multiple knives and possibly a blunt force instrument. So of course you're not going to hear about how small the closet actually is. And Bob then talks about the closet and notes that there's blood spatter everywhere inside. This point is pushed repeatedly, and it's emphasised. And it's done deliberately because a short time later Bob talks about the safe. He describes it as being all the way to the left of the closet door. And remember, this is a very small closet, so a description such as that is not necessarily painting an accurate picture. And then, interestingly, here, just moments after talking about blood spatter being absolutely everywhere in the closet, Bob notes that the area around the safe is somewhat free of blood spatter. Now, this description, along with the suggested location of the safe as being far away from anything, is important, because it fits in with the narrative built around the blood on the safe handle. Bob then highlights the position of the gun and notes that the gun was positioned on the shelf above Jim's head as he passed away. Now, whilst that is where the gun was found when Jim was discovered the following day, again, we have no idea whether it is where the gun actually was during Jim's murder. It would take very little to move the gun. It certainly wouldn't take criminal sophistication. There is then a lengthy discussion of the red rope that was found around Jim's body. Now, most of you are likely familiar with the rope, as it's been the centre of many significant discussions with respect to this aspect of the case. Now, predictably, what Bob does here is to suggest that Mr Carpenter was describing a situation where Sandra wrapped the rope around Jim after his death. Now, he does that by picking up on two specific words used by Mr Carpenter, the words draped and tucked. Now, I won't dwell on that too much for now, as you're all very aware of how those statements are designed to attack those closer to the case, but are done almost entirely without merit, and this instance is exactly the same. Now, what Bob does effectively describe is a situation where the rope would not have been able to be applied to Jim after his death, which I agree with. And I think the rope here is very important in informing us about what happened during those final moments of Jim's life in the closet. And then Bob makes an interesting suggestion about the knots, and I'll talk about this in more detail next week. He highlights how he believes that both the knot binding Sandra's wrists and the knot in the red rope around Jim's torso were handcuff knots, and importantly, that they were pre-tied in the materials before arriving at the Melgars' home. And why is that observation important? Because, as I'll explain next week, it makes the application of the binding on Sandra almost impossible. And Bob ends the episode describing his narrative surrounding the way in which Jim was murdered. And we'll leave it there for now, and we'll discuss the problems with that theory next week when we talk more about the closet scene, including the blood spatter. It was important to me this week to cover the issues of confirmation bias and to recap what has been presented in terms of the overall crime scene, for the very important reason that the material we cover commencing next Sunday begins to get uncomfortable for those absolutely convinced of Sandra's innocence, and for those not open to considering all the factual elements of the case. Elements of the case that can really only be disputed through the cries of confirmation bias or by simply turning away and ignoring the truth. If you're not interested in understanding this case from a factual perspective, the material we cover will not be appealing to you. But if you are interested, then we really do look forward to you joining us next week on Truth is Justice, as we continue to set the record straight.